Marcus Chun had always been unremarkable. At 28, he worked as a maintenance technician on the Outer Rim mining station Theta 7, fixing broken ventilation systems and patching hull breaches that the automated systems couldn't handle. His brown hair was perpetually messy from crawling through service tunnels, and his coveralls bore the permanent stains of hydraulic fluid and metal shavings. He was the kind of person who blended into crowds, forgotten moments after meeting him. That changed the day the Valerian Empire arrived. The first sign of trouble came as a deep vibration through the station's superstructure, followed by the emergency klaxons that Marcus had only heard during drills. He was elbow-deep in a malfunctioning air recycler when the lights flickered and the gravity fluctuated for a terrifying moment. All personnel report to designated assembly areas immediately. Came the announcement over the comm system, spoken in the crisp accent of Station Commander Hayes. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Marcus extracted himself from the maintenance shaft and joined the stream of workers, scientists, and station crew moving through the corridors. The viewing ports revealed the source of the disturbance. Massive ships hung in space around Theta 7, their hulls gleaming with an otherworldly metal that seemed to shift color in the starlight. They dwarfed the mining station, each vessel easily 10 times its size. The assembly area buzzed with nervous chatter as nearly 3,000 souls packed into the central hub. Commander Hayes stood at the elevated platform, her usually composed face tight with worry. Beside her, holographic displays showed the alien fleet in detail, 12 ships arranged in a perfect formation that spoke of military precision. 30 minutes ago, these vessels appeared in our system, Hayes announced, her voice carrying clearly through the crowd. They've identified themselves as representatives of the Valerian Empire. They are requesting inspection of all personnel aboard this station. A ripple of unease passed through the assembly. Marcus found himself pressed against a group of miners he recognized, but didn't know well. Their faces reflected his own concern. What did aliens want with a remote mining operation? The Valorians have assured us this is a peaceful procedure, Hayes continued, though her tone suggested she found their assurances less than comforting. They will be boarding within the hour to conduct what they term a capability assessment of all humans present. What kind of capability assessment? Called out Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the station's head xenobiologist. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who had studied alien artifacts for decades, but had never encountered living aliens. Before Hayes could respond, the lights dimmed and a new voice filled the assembly area. It was melodious, yet somehow artificial, speaking perfect English with inflections that suggested the speaker had learned the language but wasn't born to it. Citizens of the human mining installation, I am Executor Thane of the Valerian Third Fleet. Your species has come to our attention, and imperial law requires that we catalog the capabilities of any sentient races within our expanding territory. The voice seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, and Marcus noticed that several people looked around nervously, searching for speakers that weren't there. The process is simple and painless, Executor Thane continued. Each individual will be scanned to determine their biological and mental capabilities. Most will be classified and released. Some may be selected for service within the Empire, which is a great honor. Please prepare for our arrival and organize yourselves for efficient processing. The transmission ended, leaving the assembly in stunned silence. Marcus felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The casual mention of selection for service sounded ominous, like a euphemism for something far worse than employment. Commander Hayes regained her composure quickly. All department heads, report to conference room A immediately. Everyone else, return to your quarters and await further instructions. Do not attempt to leave the station or interfere with the boarding process. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus caught fragments of worried conversations. Some spoke of resistance, others of escape, but most simply expressed the helpless fear of people caught in circumstances beyond their control. Marcus made his way back to his small quarters in the technician section, his mind racing. He had read about alien encounters in the historical archives, the Zephyrians who had made peaceful contact 50 years ago, the hostile Kreks who had been driven off after a brief but brutal conflict, and dozens of other species that humanity had cataloged during its expansion into space. But the Valorians were new, and Their casual assumption of authority over human territory suggested a confidence born of overwhelming power. Marcus's quarters consisted of a small sleeping alcove, a desk, and a tiny bathroom. The walls displayed rotating images of Earth landscapes, forests, and mountains he had never seen, but somehow missed anyway. He sat on his narrow bed and tried to calm his racing thoughts. An hour later, the station shuddered again as the alien ships docked. Through the small porthole in his quarters, Marcus could see sleek shuttles attached to the station's main airlocks. The Valorians had arrived. The summons came 3 hours after that, a gentle chime on his doorcom followed by a mechanical voice. Marcus Chun, report to Docking Bay 7 for capability assessment. The walk to the docking bay felt like a funeral march. Marcus passed other workers moving in the same direction, their faces reflecting various states of anxiety and resignation. Some tried to make jokes, others walked in grim silence. A few had clearly been crying. Docking Bay 7 had been transformed into a processing center. Sleek alien equipment had been installed with impossible speed, scanning devices that hummed with barely audible energy, and holographic displays showing incomprehensible data streams. The bay was divided into several stations, each staffed by a Valorian. Marcus got his first good look at humanity's visitors and found himself both impressed and unsettled. The Valorians stood nearly 8 feet tall, with elongated limbs and graceful movements that suggested they had evolved in lower gravity than Earth normal. Their skin had a subtle metallic sheen, shifting between silver and pale gold depending on the light, and their large eyes were a startling violet color. They wore form-fitting uniforms that seemed to be made of the same color-shifting material as their ships. But it was their bearing that struck Marcus most forcefully. Every Valorian moved with the absolute confidence of a superior being examining interesting, but ultimately inferior specimens. They weren't cruel or overtly hostile. They simply radiated the assumption that humans existed at their sufferance. Next, called one of the Valorians in that same melodious voice that had addressed the assembly. Marcus stepped forward to the scanning station, his legs feeling unsteady. The Valorian, tall even by their standards, with intricate markings on their uniform that suggested high rank, looked down at Marcus with those unsettling violet eyes. State your designation and function. Marcus Chun, Maintenance Technician, Class 3. Step into the scanning array. The device looked like a vertical cylinder made of translucent material that shimmered with inner light. Marcus hesitated, and the Valorian's expression shifted slightly, not to anger, but to the sort of mild impatience one might show toward a stubborn pet. The process is harmless to beings of your physiological limitations, the alien said. Step into the array. Marcus entered the cylinder and immediately felt a tingling sensation across his entire body. Light played across his skin, and he could hear the hum of the scanning equipment increase in pitch. Through the translucent walls, he could see the Valorian watching displays that showed incomprehensible patterns of color and symbol. The scanning seemed to go on forever, though Marcus's internal chronometer suggested it lasted only 30 seconds. The tingling sensation grew stronger, almost uncomfortable, and for a moment he felt dizzy. Then, the humming stopped, and the cylinder's walls became transparent. Exit the array, the Valorian commanded, but there was something different in its voice, a note of confusion or surprise. Marcus stepped out, feeling oddly energized rather than drained by the experience. The Valorian was staring at the displays with an expression that Marcus couldn't read, but that seemed distinctly troubled. Remain here, the alien said, then spoke rapidly in its own language to another Valorian who had approached the station. Marcus caught none of the words, but the tone suggested urgent consultation. More Valorians gathered around the displays, their voices rising in what sounded like an animated discussion. Marcus stood awkwardly beside the scanning array, aware that other humans in the bay were looking in his direction with curiosity and growing concern. Finally, the original Valorian turned back to Marcus. You will submit to enhanced scanning. Is there a problem? Marcus asked. The Valorian didn't answer directly. Instead, it gestured toward a larger, more complex device that had been wheeled over from another part of the bay. This scanner looked more medical in nature, with articulated arms ending in sensor clusters, and a platform that suggested the subject would need to lie down. The initial scan produced anomalous readings, the Valerian explained as Marcus reluctantly approached the new device. Enhanced scanning will provide clarification. Marcus lay down on the platform as directed, trying to ignore the fact that half the Valorians in the bay were now watching his scan with obvious interest. The enhanced scanner activated with a sound like singing crystals, and immediately Marcus felt a much more intense sensation than before, not painful, but overwhelming, as if every cell in his body was being examined individually. The scan lasted much longer this time, nearly 5 minutes by Marcus's count. When it finally ended, the group of watching Valorians had grown to include what looked like senior officers, distinguishable by the complexity of their uniform markings. The displays around the enhanced scanner flickered and changed, showing patterns that seemed to shift and evolve even as Marcus watched. The Valorians spoke in urgent, hushed tones, occasionally glancing at Marcus with expressions he was beginning to recognize as surprise or even concern. "Impossible," he heard one of them say in English, apparently forgetting that humans were present. "Run it again," commanded a new voice, deeper and more authoritative than the others. Marcus turned to see a Valerian who was clearly of high rank, with golden markings on their uniform and bearing that suggested command authority. "Sir, the readings are consistent across multiple scans," replied the technician who had first examined Marcus. "The human's biological matrix shows impossible stability. The quantum resonance patterns are unprecedented." The commander studied the displays, then looked at Marcus with an expression that was definitely surprise. "What is your lineage, human? What is your genetic heritage?" Marcus found the question confusing. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. My parents were both from Earth, if that's what you mean. My grandparents immigrated from the Asian Continental Union." The Valorians exchanged glances that suggested this information was somehow significant. The commander stepped closer to Marcus, studying him with an intensity that was deeply uncomfortable. "You will remain here while we consult with higher authority," the commander said finally. "Do not attempt to leave this area." 2 Valerian guards took positions near Marcus as the command group moved away to confer in private. Marcus sat on a nearby bench, trying to process what had just happened. Other humans were still being scanned at the other stations, their processing proceeding normally and quickly. Most were being classified, given some kind of marking device, and sent away within minutes. But Marcus remained under guard, watched by increasingly senior Valorians who seemed genuinely puzzled by whatever their scanners had found. Dr. Warren approached during a break in her own processing. She had been classified as a research specialist and was scheduled for what the Valorians termed voluntary service placement on one of their ships. "Marcus, what happened?" she asked quietly, glancing at the guards. "You've been here for over an hour, and they keep scanning you." "I don't know," Marcus replied honestly. "They say the readings are anomalous, but they won't tell me what that means." Dr. Warren looked at the complex displays still showing Marcus's scan results. As a xenobiologist, she had some familiarity with alien technology, though Valerian science was beyond her expertise. "Those patterns," she murmured, studying the shifting displays. "I've never seen anything like them. It's almost as if your biological signature is resistant to their scanning technology." Before Marcus could ask what that might mean, the Valerian commander returned with an even more senior officer, one whose uniform was predominantly gold and whose bearing suggested they rarely left their ship for mundane tasks. "You are Marcus Chun," the new arrival said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, I am Fleet Commander Zareth. In 300 years of Valerian expansion, we have scanned millions of beings from hundreds of species. Your readings are unique." Marcus felt a chill. Being unique in the context of an alien empire's expansion didn't sound like something that would lead to a comfortable retirement. "What does that mean?" he asked. Fleet Commander Zareth gestured to the displays. "Our scanning technology measures biological potential, physical capability, mental capacity, genetic stability, and what you might call spiritual resonance. Most beings register within predictable parameters. Some are stronger, some more intelligent, some more genetically robust. But all fall within ranges we have documented." The fleet commander paused, as if weighing how much to reveal to a human. Your readings suggest biological and quantum stability at levels that should not exist in a natural organism. According to our instruments, you possess cellular cohesion that would allow survival of energies that would destroy most beings. Your neural patterns indicate resistance to mental influences that affect even Valerian minds. Most remarkably, your quantum signature suggests you might survive direct contact with forces that are considered divine. Marcus stared at the alien commander, trying to process words that seemed to describe someone else entirely. I think your machines are broken. I'm just a maintenance worker. I fix air recyclers and patch hull breaches. Our machines do not malfunction. Fleet Commander Zareth replied with certainty. We will transport you to our capital ship for examination by our highest-ranking scientists. If our readings are confirmed, you will be presented to the Supreme God for evaluation. The mention of the Supreme God sent a murmur through the nearby humans who had overheard. Dr. Warren stepped closer to Marcus, her face pale. Supreme God? Marcus asked. The divine being who guides our empire. Zareth explained matter-of-factly. A entity of pure energy who has led us to conquest across 1,000 worlds. If you are what our scans suggest, the Supreme God will find you interesting. Marcus felt the cold knot in his stomach grow larger. He looked around the docking bay at the other humans being processed, most of whom were being classified for various forms of service. Their fate seemed uncertain, but probably survivable. His fate was beginning to sound much worse. What if I refuse? He asked. Fleet Commander Zareth's expression didn't change, but somehow managed to convey that refusal wasn't a concept that applied to this situation. You are a sentient being under Imperial jurisdiction, the commander said. Refusal is not a relevant concept. You will board our ship within the hour for transport to the capital vessel. Prepare yourself for the greatest honor any being of your species has ever received, an audience with divinity itself. As guards escorted Marcus away from the docking bay, he caught a last glimpse of his fellow humans still being processed. Some looked relieved to have been classified for relatively mundane service. Others seemed frightened of their unknown futures. But all of them looked at Marcus with a mixture of sympathy and gratitude that it was him, not them, being taken for special attention by an alien empire that casually mentioned divine audiences. Marcus Chun, unremarkable maintenance technician, was about to discover that sometimes being unremarkable is the most remarkable thing of all. The Valerian escort ship was a masterpiece of technology that made human engineering look primitive by comparison. The walls seemed to be made of the same color-shifting material as the alien's skin, and the corridors curved in ways that suggested the ship's geometry operated by rules different from normal space. Marcus was given quarters that were luxurious by human standards, larger than his entire living space on Theta 7, with walls that displayed soothing patterns of light and furniture that adjusted itself to his body. But luxury couldn't disguise the fact that he was a prisoner traveling toward an unknown fate. The journey to the Valerian capital ship took 3 days, during which Marcus was subjected to increasingly sophisticated scans and tests. Valerian scientists examined him with equipment that hummed with energies he couldn't identify, always looking confused by the results. They took samples of his blood, hair, and tissue, all of which apparently displayed the same impossible stability that had originally caught their attention. Dr. Saleth, the ship's chief scientific officer, spoke better English than most Valorians and seemed genuinely puzzled by Marcus's case. In our expansion across the galaxy, we have encountered beings of great power, she explained during one of their sessions. Creatures that manipulate energy, entities that exist partially outside normal space-time, races that have transcended physical limitations. But they all conform to certain fundamental rules of existence. You appear to violate several of those rules simply by existing. Marcus had given up trying to convince them that they were wrong. The evidence of their instruments was too consistent, and their technology too advanced, for simple malfunction to explain the readings. Something about him was genuinely unusual, even if he couldn't feel or understand what it was. On the 3rd day, they arrived at the capital ship. Marcus had thought the fleet vessels around Theta 7 were large, but the capital ship was beyond impressive. It was impossible. The thing filled the viewports like a small moon, its surface covered with structures that might have been cities or might have been weapon systems. The ship was so large that it had its own weather patterns, visible as clouds swirling around its upper atmosphere. The Eternal Dominion, Dr. Saleth said, noting Marcus's amazement. Home to 20 million beings from across the Empire. It has never known defeat in 1,000 years of expansion. Marcus was transferred to the massive ship via a shuttle that took an hour just to traverse the distance from docking bay to docking bay. The Eternal Dominion was a world unto itself, with multiple levels that stretched beyond the horizon and transportation systems that moved beings and cargo through corridors wide enough for aircraft. But what struck Marcus most forcefully was the diversity. The Valorians made up perhaps half the ship's population, but he saw dozens of other species, some humanoid, others so alien that he couldn't immediately determine which end was the front. Most wore variations of the Valorian uniform, suggesting they were integrated members of the Empire rather than prisoners or slaves. The Empire welcomes all beings who prove useful, explained his new escort, a Valorian officer named Subcommander Veltar. Species that demonstrate value are offered membership. Those that refuse or prove inadequate are removed. The casualness with which Veltar mentioned removal of entire species made Marcus's stomach clench. This wasn't just a military expansion, it was systematic conquest and absorption on a galactic scale. They traveled for another hour through corridors that grew progressively more elaborate, until Marcus found himself in sections of the ship that seemed more like a palace than a military vessel. The walls were decorated with intricate patterns that shifted and flowed like living art, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with barely visible energy. Finally, they arrived at a massive chamber that could have held a small city. The ceiling was lost in misty distance above, and the walls curved away in all directions. At the center of the chamber sat a structure that was part throne, part altar, and part technological marvel, a raised dais surrounded by flowing energy patterns and attended by dozens of beings who radiated an aura of importance. "Approach the presence," commanded a voice that seemed to come from the air itself. Marcus walked across the vast floor, feeling increasingly small as he neared the central dais. The beings attending the throne, if that's what it was, represented various species, all wearing elaborate versions of imperial uniforms that marked them as high-ranking officials. But it was the figure on the throne itself that made Marcus stop breathing for a moment. The supreme god of the Valorian Empire was not what he had expected. Instead of a creature of flesh and blood, or even energy in a recognizable form, it was something that hurt to look at directly, a constantly shifting confluence of light and shadow that seemed to exist in more dimensions than Marcus's eyes could process. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through his bones rather than his ears. "So," the supreme god said, "you are the anomaly." Marcus found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I guess so." The supreme god's attention focused on him with an intensity that made Marcus feel as if he were being examined at the cellular level. "Our instruments indicate you possess resistances that should not exist in a naturally evolved being. You appear immune to energies that would unmake most forms of life. Most intriguingly, your quantum signature suggests you might survive direct contact with divine force." The assembled officials watched in silence as their god examined the human who had disrupted their perfectly ordered processing of a minor mining station. "There is only one way to verify these readings," the supreme god continued, and somehow Marcus knew what was coming before the words were spoken. "You will be subjected to the divine test. If you survive, your resistance is real, and you will serve as our instrument in conquering realms that have previously been beyond our reach. If you do not survive, you will join the energy that powers this ship, and your people will be relocated to suitable service worlds." Marcus wanted to run, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. Around him, the assembled officials leaned forward with obvious interest. Apparently, watching a divine being test a random human was considered entertainment. "What exactly is the divine test?" Marcus managed to ask. The supreme god's form shifted, becoming slightly more solid, and somehow more terrible to behold. "I will strike you with a focused beam of divine energy, the same force that powers our ships, and has destroyed the gods of 100 conquered species. If our scans are correct, you will survive. If they are not, you will cease to exist. Marcus looked around the chamber at the dozens of alien faces watching him. Some seemed curious, others bored, a few appeared sympathetic. But none seemed surprised by the casual threat to destroy him for the sake of satisfying their god's scientific curiosity. "And if I refuse?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Refusal will be interpreted as confirmation that our scans were incorrect. Your people will be immediately relocated, and you will be terminated for wasting our time." Marcus felt a strange calm settle over him. He was going to die either way. The only question was whether he went down fighting or begging. And if there was even the slightest chance that surviving would help protect the other humans, he had to take it. "All right," he said. "Let's get this over with." The Supreme God's form shifted again, taking on a configuration that suggested pleased surprise. "Interesting. Most beings plead for mercy or attempt to flee. You accept the inevitable with remarkable composure." Marcus shrugged, a gesture that felt absurd in the circumstances, but somehow helped him maintain his composure. "I've been fixing broken things my whole life. Sometimes the only way to test a repair is to put it under stress." The assembled officials stirred at this response, and Marcus caught fragments of whispered conversation in various alien languages. Apparently, treating a divine test as an engineering challenge was not the typical response. "Very well," the Supreme God said. "Prepare yourself, human. You are about to discover whether your species possesses capabilities beyond our current understanding or whether our instruments require recalibration." Energy began to build around the throne, visible as crackling streams of light that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Marcus felt his hair stand on end and tasted copper on his tongue. The officials around the chamber stepped back, some raising what looked like protective shields. The Supreme God raised what might have been an arm, and Marcus saw energy gathering at its focal point, power that made the fusion reactors he had worked on look like candle flames. "Divine test commencing," the Supreme God announced. "Marcus Chun of Earth, prepare to meet your destiny." The energy beam struck Marcus like the fist of a star. The beam of divine energy struck him with the force of a collapsing star, and for a moment that lasted eternity, he felt as if every atom in his body was being examined, tested, and judged. The energy coursed through him like liquid fire, seeking weaknesses, looking for the fundamental flaws that would allow it to tear him apart at the molecular level. But instead of destruction, Marcus felt energized. The divine force flowed around him rather than through him, as if his body was rejecting something that should have been irresistible. He could feel the energy trying to find purchase, searching for the cellular vulnerabilities that existed in every living thing, but somehow failing to locate them. The power that had destroyed gods and shattered worlds broke against Marcus like waves against an immovable stone. The chamber had fallen completely silent. Through the blazing torrent of energy still washing over him, Marcus could see the assembled officials staring in what looked like shock. Even the Supreme God's constantly shifting form had become still, as if the divine being was experiencing something unprecedented in its existence. Finally, after what felt like hours but had probably been only seconds, the energy beam ceased. Marcus stood exactly where he had been, completely unharmed. His clothes weren't even singed. In fact, he felt better than he had in years, more alert, more energetic, as if the divine assault had somehow improved rather than damaged him. The silence stretched on for long moments before the Supreme God spoke, its voice carrying a note of what might have been wonder. "Impossible." Around the chamber, officials whispered urgently to each other in a dozen different languages. Some were backing away from Marcus as if he had become dangerous, while others leaned forward with obvious fascination. A few were operating handheld devices that Marcus assumed were scanners, probably trying to understand what they had just witnessed. "The energy readings are consistent with full divine force application," reported one of the officials, a Valerian with scientific markings on her uniform. "But the human shows no damage, no cellular disruption, no quantum decay. If anything, his biological stability has increased." The Supreme God's attention focused on Marcus with renewed intensity. "You absorbed divine energy and converted it to personal enhancement. This should not be possible for any naturally occurring organism." Marcus looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers. He could feel strength flowing through his body that hadn't been there before, and his vision seemed sharper, more detailed. The alien characters on nearby control surfaces were becoming comprehensible, as if the energy had enhanced his ability to process information. "I don't understand what's happening to me," Marcus said, his voice carrying more clearly through the vast chamber than it should have been able to. "But I'm definitely not dead." The Supreme God's form shifted through several configurations before settling into something that seemed more attentive, more focused on Marcus than it had been on anything else in the chamber. "For 1,000 years, we have expanded across the galaxy, absorbing species and worlds into our empire. Our divine energy has proven irresistible to every form of life we have encountered. Gods have bowed before our power. Ancient entities that claimed immortality have been reduced to component energy. You are the first being to not merely resist divine force, but to benefit from it." One of the senior officials, a tall alien with crystalline features, stepped forward. "Supreme God, if this human can absorb divine energy without harm, he represents either a tremendous asset or a catastrophic threat to Imperial security." Marcus didn't like the sound of that. Being considered either an asset or a threat by a galactic empire probably meant his quiet life was over forever. "Both conclusions are accurate," the Supreme God replied. "A being immune to divine energy could serve as our instrument in realms where our direct intervention would be detected and resisted. Alternatively, such a being could theoretically pose a threat to our expansion if properly motivated and equipped." The crystal being nodded. "Shall we proceed with termination protocols to eliminate the potential threat?" Marcus felt his heart rate spike, but before he could speak, the Supreme God made a sound that might have been laughter. "No, Admiral Kethral. This human will serve our purposes in a different capacity. His resistance to divine energy makes him uniquely qualified for missions that would be impossible for any other being in our empire." The Admiral looked skeptical. "Supreme God, respectfully, how can we trust an alien being whose capabilities we do not understand? His loyalty to the Empire is questionable at best." Marcus found his voice. "You're talking about me like I'm not standing right here." The Supreme God's attention shifted back to him. "You raise an interesting point, human. What are your intentions regarding our empire? Do you plan to serve willingly, or will we need to provide motivation?" The question was asked with casual curiosity, but Marcus could sense the threat underlying it. His answer would determine not just his own fate, but possibly the fate of every human in the mining station. "What happened to my people on Theta 7? He asked. "They are being processed according to standard Imperial protocols," Admiral Kethral replied. "Those suitable for service have been relocated to appropriate positions within the Empire. Those deemed unsuitable have been transferred to agricultural worlds where their labor will prove useful." Marcus didn't like the sound of "those deemed unsuitable," but he suspected pushing for details would only confirm his worst fears. The important thing was that his fellow humans were still alive. "If I serve your empire," Marcus said carefully, "what guarantee do I have that humans will be treated fairly?" The Supreme God's form rippled with what might have been amusement. "You are hardly in a position to negotiate terms, human. However, your unique capabilities do grant you certain considerations. Species that provide exceptional value to the Empire receive enhanced status and protection." "What kind of service are you talking about?" "There are realms beyond this dimension where divine energy encounters resistance," the Supreme God explained. "Ancient powers that have learned to shield themselves from our direct intervention. Entities that exist in spaces where our ships cannot travel. Until now, these realms have remained unconquered because our forces cannot operate effectively there." Marcus was beginning to understand where this conversation was heading, and he didn't like it. "You want me to go to places where your armies can't operate and conquer them for you?" "Precisely. Your immunity to divine energy suggests you might also possess resistance to other forms of transcendent power. You could serve as our agent in realms that have remained beyond Imperial reach." The assembled officials watched this exchange with obvious interest. Marcus got the impression that resistance to Imperial expansion was rare enough that several unconquered realms represented significant frustration for the Empire. "And if I refuse?" The Supreme God's form became more solid, and somehow more threatening. "Then, You will be terminated as a potential threat, and your species will be reclassified from limited service to expendable labor. The distinction is significant in terms of survival rates and living conditions. Marcus felt the weight of an impossible decision. Accept a role as an interdimensional conqueror for an empire he had never heard of until a week ago, or doom his entire species to whatever expendable labor meant in Valerian terms. Can I have some time to think about it? You have until we reach the next target system, the Supreme God replied. We are currently en route to the Threshold Realm, where an entity known as the Eternal Empress has resisted imperial advancement for 3 centuries. It will serve as an excellent test of your capabilities. Admiral Kethral stepped forward again. Supreme God, with respect, sending an untested and potentially unreliable agent into the Threshold Realm could compromise our strategic position. Perhaps we should conduct additional evaluation before. The Supreme God's interruption cut through the Admiral's words like a blade. Your concerns are noted and dismissed, Admiral. This human represents our first opportunity to access realms that have remained closed to imperial expansion. The potential rewards justify the risks. Marcus found himself escorted from the throne chamber by a full squad of Valerian guards, though they seemed more ceremonial than hostile. He was given quarters that were significantly more luxurious than his previous accommodations, a suite that included multiple rooms, a view of space that showed the twisted geometries of faster-than-light travel, and access to imperial databases that contained information about dozens of alien species. Left alone for the first time since his capture, Marcus tried to process what had happened to him. A week ago, he had been fixing air recyclers and patching hull breaches on a mining station. Now he was apparently immune to divine energy and being pressured to serve as an interdimensional operative for a galactic empire. He accessed the imperial databases and began researching the Threshold Realm, hoping to understand what he was being asked to walk into. The information was extensive but disturbing. The Threshold Realm existed in a space adjacent to normal reality, accessible only through specific dimensional gateways that appeared at random intervals. The realm was ruled by the Eternal Empress, a being of unknown origin who commanded reality-warping powers that made Valerian divine energy look like a child's toy. Previous imperial attempts to conquer the Threshold Realm had ended in disaster. Entire fleets had vanished without trace upon entering the dimensional gateways. The few survivors who had escaped spoke of a realm where the laws of physics were suggestions, and where the Eternal Empress could reshape matter and energy with a thought. But the realm contained resources that the Valerian Empire coveted, crystallized time that could power their ships for millennia, minerals that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and, most importantly, access to other realms that the Empire had been unable to reach. Marcus spent hours reading about the failed expeditions and the theoretical analyses of why Imperial forces had proven ineffective in the Threshold Realm. The consistent factor seemed to be that the realm operated by rules that were incompatible with Valerian technology and divine energy. Their ships malfunctioned, their weapons failed, and their protective systems offered no defense against attacks that occurred outside normal spacetime. A chime at his door interrupted his research. He opened it to find Dr. Saleth, the Valerian scientist who had examined him during the journey to the capital ship. "May I enter?" she asked. "I have additional questions about your biological anomalies." Marcus gestured her inside, grateful for the company. "Have you figured out why I'm apparently immune to divine energy?" Dr. Saleth settled into one of the adaptive chairs, her expression thoughtful. "Not immune, precisely. Our readings suggest that your cellular structure processes divine energy differently than any other life form we have encountered. Instead of being disrupted by the energy, your cells appear to absorb it and use it to enhance their own stability. That doesn't sound like something that should be possible. It should not be. According to our understanding of biology and quantum mechanics, divine energy should overwhelm any natural organism's ability to process it. But your cells contain structures that we cannot identify, organelles that do not appear in any other Earth-based life forms we have scanned." Marcus felt a chill. "Are you saying I'm not human?" "You are certainly human in terms of your genetic structure and basic biology. But You possess additional cellular components that appear to be designed for processing exotic energies. The question is how you acquired them. I've never been exposed to anything exotic. I grew up on Earth, went to technical school, got a job fixing machinery. Nothing in my background explains this. Dr. Saleth produced a handheld device and activated a holographic display showing Marcus's cellular structure in incredible detail. These anomalous organelles appear to be distributed throughout your body, but they are most concentrated in your nervous system. They seem to interface directly with your brain's electrical activity. The hologram rotated, highlighting structures that looked like tiny crystalline formations embedded in Marcus's neurons. We have theorized that these structures might be artifacts of genetic engineering performed by an unknown species, but there is no evidence of such intervention in your DNA. Alternatively, they could be the result of exposure to energies that we have not yet cataloged. Marcus studied the strange formations in his own brain tissue. Could they be why I seem to be understanding alien languages more easily now? After the divine energy test, I started being able to read some of the Valerian text displays. Possibly. The structures show increased activity since your exposure to divine energy. It is as if they were dormant until activated by contact with exotic forces. Dr. Saleth deactivated the hologram and leaned forward with obvious curiosity. Marcus, can you remember any unusual experiences from your childhood? Encounters with unknown phenomena? Exposure to energies or substances that seemed strange? Marcus thought back through his memories, searching for anything that might explain his condition. His childhood had been remarkably normal. School, friends, family vacations to various colonies. His parents had been engineers working on terraforming projects, and they had moved frequently during his early years as they were assigned to different worlds. Wait, Marcus said, a half-forgotten memory surfacing. When I was about 7 years old, we were living on Kepler Station while my parents worked on atmospheric processing for Kepler 442b. There was an accident at one of the research facilities. Dr. Saleth's eyes brightened with interest. What kind of accident? I don't remember all the details. Something about an experiment with exotic matter that got out of control. There was an evacuation, and everyone in the research sector was taken to medical for examination. I remember being in some kind of scanning chamber for hours while doctors talked in worried voices outside. What happened after the examination? Marcus frowned, trying to recall events from more than 20 years ago. Nothing, as far as I know. They said I was fine and sent us home. But, now that I think about it, my parents seemed really nervous for weeks afterward. They kept taking me back for follow-up examinations until we transferred to a different assignment. Dr. Saleth was taking notes on her device. Exotic matter exposure during childhood could explain the anomalous cellular structures. If you were exposed to energies that your developing nervous system adapted to rather than being damaged by, it could have resulted in the modifications we observe. So this isn't something natural? Almost certainly not. You appear to be the result of an accidental exposure that created capabilities no one anticipated. The question now is how extensive those capabilities might prove to be. Their conversation was interrupted by another chime at the door. This time, the visitor was Subcommander Veltar, the officer who had escorted Marcus through the capital ship. Marcus Chun, you are summoned to the command bridge. We have arrived at the threshold realm. Marcus felt his stomach drop. The time for research and contemplation had ended. Whatever decision he was going to make about serving the Valerian Empire, he needed to make it now. Dr. Saleth stood as well. I will accompany you, if permitted. Your mission may provide valuable data about your capabilities. Mission? Marcus asked. I haven't agreed to anything yet. Subcommander Veltar's expression suggested that Marcus's agreement was not particularly relevant. The Supreme God has determined that field testing of your abilities takes precedence over your personal preferences. You will enter the threshold realm and attempt to make contact with the Eternal Empress. The journey to the command bridge took them through sections of the ship that Marcus hadn't seen before. Vast chambers filled with weapons systems that hummed with barely contained energy, strategic centers where hundreds of beings coordinated the movements of entire fleets, and observation decks that provided views of space that were simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. The command bridge itself was a cathedral of technology, with displays showing information streams from across the Empire and communication arrays that connected the Eternal Dominion to thousands of other ships. At the center of it all, the Supreme God's presence was represented by a complex energy matrix that seemed to exist partially outside normal space. Approached the tactical display. The Supreme God commanded as Marcus entered the bridge. The main display showed a region of space that looked wrong, not empty, but somehow twisted, as if reality itself was bent around an invisible gravitational anomaly. Floating in the center of the distortion was a structure that might have been a space station or might have been a crystal formation, its geometry shifting constantly, as if it existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Threshold Realm, Admiral Kethral explained. The gateway appears stable, but our ships cannot approach within effective weapons range without suffering system failures. The realm's reality distortion effects prevent our technology from functioning normally. Marcus stared at the impossible structure on the display. You want me to go in there alone? Not alone, the Supreme God replied. You will be accompanied by a small team of specialists equipped with technology designed to function in reality-distorted environments. However, you will serve as the primary contact agent due to your apparent immunity to exotic energies. And what exactly am I supposed to accomplish? Negotiate the Eternal Empress's surrender or determine her weaknesses for future conquest attempts. The Threshold Realm contains resources essential to our continued expansion, and its strategic position grants access to several unconquered dimensional sectors. Marcus looked around the bridge at the dozens of alien beings who were all watching him with various degrees of interest and skepticism. These beings had conquered hundreds of worlds and absorbed dozens of species into their empire. They commanded technology that could reshape matter and energy at will, and they were asking a human maintenance technician to solve a problem that had stumped them for 3 centuries. What if the Eternal Empress decides to kill me instead of negotiating? The Supreme God's energy matrix shifted in what might have been a shrug. Then, we will have learned valuable information about the nature of reality distortion effects on beings with your capabilities. The data will inform future conquest strategies. Marcus realized he was being sent on a mission where the Empire considered his survival optional. Whether he succeeded in negotiations or died horribly, they would gain intelligence that served their purposes. And if I refuse to go, then you will be terminated as a failed asset, and your species will be reclassified accordingly. Marcus looked at the display again, studying the twisted space around the Threshold Realm. Whatever was waiting for him in that place, it had to be better than watching his entire species condemned to expendable labor status. All right, he said. I'll do it. The bridge fell silent for a moment before Admiral Kethral spoke. Supreme God, with respect, perhaps we should provide the human with additional preparation time. The mission parameters are adequate as stated, the Supreme God interrupted. Time is a factor in this operation. The gateway to the Threshold Realm is currently stable, but our calculations indicate it may shift to an inaccessible phase within the next several hours. This represents our best opportunity for contact in decades. Marcus felt a familiar sinking sensation. Not only was he being sent into a reality-distorted dimension to negotiate with a being who commanded impossible powers, but he was being sent immediately, without preparation or training. Can I at least know what I'm supposed to say to this Eternal Empress? Terms for Imperial membership, Admiral Kethral replied, producing a small device that projected a holographic document. Standard conquest protocols adapted for entities of transcendent capability. She will surrender control of the Threshold Realm in exchange for elevated status within the Empire. Marcus scanned the terms, which were written in the sort of bureaucratic language that made contract negotiations sound reasonable while hiding the fact that acceptance meant total subjugation. What if she says no? Then, you will gather intelligence on her capabilities and weaknesses while attempting to survive long enough for extraction. How exactly are you planning to extract me from a dimension where your ships can't operate? The Supreme God's energy matrix pulsed with what might have been anticipation. We are not. If negotiations fail, you will remain in the Threshold Realm until you either find a way to escape independently or provide us with information that enables successful conquest. Your survival is desirable, but not essential to mission success. Marcus stared at the alien beings surrounding him, finally understanding the true nature of his situation. He wasn't being recruited as an agent or a diplomat. He was being used as an expendable probe, sent into a hostile dimension to gather intelligence for a future invasion. The Empire didn't particularly care whether he lived or died, as long as they learned something useful from his sacrifice. "When do I leave?" he asked. "Immediately," Admiral Kethral replied. "Your transport is being prepared." The transport vessel that would carry Marcus into the Threshold Realm looked more like an escape pod than a diplomatic courier. The ship was barely large enough for a crew of 6, constructed from materials that seemed to shift color and texture constantly, as if the hull itself was uncertain about what it wanted to be. "Adaptive matter," explained Engineer Kelthane, a spider-like being with 8 manipulator arms who had been assigned to Marcus's team. "The hull composition adjusts to environmental conditions automatically. In reality-distorted space, conventional materials tend to forget what they are supposed to be." Marcus's team consisted of 4 beings besides himself. Kelthane, whose engineering expertise was apparently essential for keeping their ship functional in impossible space. Navigator Vashti, a crystalline entity that existed partially in multiple dimensions and could theoretically find paths through twisted reality. Communications specialist Mordun, whose cybernetic implants allowed him to interface with technology that operated by non-standard logic. And Security Chief Krentak, a being who looked like a cross between a bear and a tank, and whose job was to keep everyone alive if negotiations went badly. None of them seemed particularly optimistic about their mission's chances of success. Previous expeditions into the Threshold Realm have resulted in 96% casualty rates, Krentak explained as they ran through final systems checks. The survivors reported reality distortions that made navigation impossible, communication failures across all frequencies, and hostile entities that existed outside normal spacetime. Marcus was studying the adaptive controls that would supposedly allow him to pilot the ship if everyone else died, though the interface seemed to change configuration every time he looked away from it. "What kind of hostile entities?" "Constructs of crystallized thought," Navigator Vashti replied, her voice sounding like wind chimes in a storm. "Beings that exist as pure concept rather than matter. The Eternal Empress apparently creates guardians from the dreams and fears of those who enter her realm." "That sounds appropriately terrifying." Communications specialist Mordun looked up from his console, his cybernetic eye glowing with data streams. "Intelligence reports suggest that the Threshold Realm operates by rules of narrative causality rather than physics. Actions and events occur because they fulfill story patterns rather than following logical cause and effect." Marcus felt his headache getting worse. "So you're telling me that I'm about to enter a dimension where the laws of physics have been replaced by the rules of storytelling?" "Essentially correct," Kelthane confirmed. "Which is why conventional military approaches have failed. Valerian tactics assume predictable responses to physical force. In narrative space, overwhelming firepower might simply result in the villain becoming more dangerous, or the heroes developing last-minute advantages. And I'm supposed to negotiate with the person who controls this place? The Eternal Empress has ruled the Threshold Realm for millennia," Vashti said. "She is described as a being of transcendent beauty and impossible power who can reshape reality with a thought. Some reports suggest she was once mortal but transcended her original nature through mastery of narrative forces." Marcus looked around at his team, all of whom were checking weapons and equipment with the systematic thoroughness of people who expected to die, but planned to make it expensive for their enemies. "Has anyone considered that maybe we should just leave the Threshold Realm alone?" Marcus asked. "If it's that dangerous and difficult to access, maybe it's not worth conquering." The entire team stared at him as if he had suggested something blasphemous. "The Empire does not abandon conquest objectives," Krentak said firmly. "Failure to expand is considered a form of defeat. The Valerian way demands that all realms eventually bow to imperial authority, even realms that might be more powerful than the Empire. Especially those realms," Mordun replied. "Power that exists outside imperial control represents a potential threat to our expansion. The Supreme God's strategic doctrine requires that all transcendent entities either submit to imperial authority or be destroyed." Marcus began to understand why the Eternal Empress might not be interested in negotiating. From her perspective, The Valerian Empire probably looked like a cosmic-scale protection racket demanding tribute from everyone in the galaxy. Approaching dimensional boundary, Vashti announced. Reality distortion effects beginning in 30 seconds. Through the ship's viewports, Marcus could see the twisted space around the threshold realm growing larger and more wrong-looking as they approached. The starfield beyond the distortion seemed to bend and shift, as if space itself was being folded into impossible configurations. Remember, Kelthane said, once we cross the boundary, our communication with the capital ship will be severed. We are entirely on our own until we complete the mission or find a way back to normal space. The ship shuddered as it crossed into the reality distortion field, and immediately Marcus felt a sensation like falling in multiple directions simultaneously. The control surfaces around him flickered between different configurations, settling into arrangements that looked functional but operated by rules that made no logical sense. Through the viewports, the threshold realm revealed itself in all its impossible glory. Marcus had expected something like a space station or an artificial structure, but the realm was more like a landscape floating in the void. Crystalline mountains rose from fields of what looked like solidified starlight, while forests of metallic trees grew in spirals that extended in directions that shouldn't have existed. Rivers of liquid energy flowed upward through the air, forming waterfalls that fell into the sky. At the center of it all stood a palace that defied architectural logic. The structure seemed to be built from crystallized music, its towers and spires shifting between different geometric forms, as if the building was dancing to a rhythm only it could hear. Gardens of living gemstones surrounded the palace, and pathways of pure light connected different sections of the realm in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Magnificent, Vashti whispered. The Eternal Empress has created a realm where beauty and impossibility coexist perfectly. Incoming transmission, Mordun announced, his cybernetic implants sparking with data flow. Multiple frequencies, some of which don't technically exist. Put it through, Marcus said, assuming command of the mission by default since he was the one expected to do the talking. The voice that filled the ship was like liquid honey poured over steel, beautiful but carrying an undertone of absolute authority that made Marcus's bones vibrate. Welcome to the Threshold Realm, servants of the Empire. I am the Eternal Empress, sovereign of this domain and guardian of the spaces between dreams. You have traveled far to reach my realm, though I suspect your purposes are not as noble as your journey. Marcus activated the communication system, hoping it would work despite the reality distortions. Eternal Empress, I am Marcus Chun, representative of the Valerian Empire. We come seeking dialogue and mutual understanding. The Empress's laughter was like crystal bells breaking in harmony. Oh, my dear mortal, do you truly believe I am unaware of your empire's methods? I have watched your expansion across the galaxy, observed your systematic absorption of species and civilizations. You do not seek dialogue, you seek submission. Through the viewports, Marcus could see structures moving across the realm's landscape. They looked like ships, but moved in ways that defied physics, some flying through solid matter while others seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. The Empire offers membership and protection to species that demonstrate value, Marcus said, reading from the diplomatic protocols Admiral Kethral had provided. Your realm's unique properties and resources would benefit from imperial integration and technological advancement. Integration, the Empress repeated, and somehow her voice carried visual images along with the sound. Marcus could see flashes of conquered worlds, species stripped of their individuality and transformed into efficient imperial servants. How delightfully euphemistic. Tell me, little envoy, do you know what happened to the last imperial delegation that visited my realm? Marcus glanced at his team, none of whom looked like they wanted to answer that question. I was told that previous expeditions encountered difficulties with the local environment. Difficulties? The Empress's amusement filled the ship like perfume. They arrived with weapons and shields, demanding surrender and threatening destruction if I refused to comply. So I granted their request for demonstration of my capabilities. The ship's sensors detected movement approaching from multiple directions. The entities that had been moving across the realm's surface were converging on their position, and As they grew closer, Marcus could see that they were not ships at all. They were dreams given form. Crystalline sculptures that depicted scenes of beauty and terror, geometric patterns that existed in too many dimensions, and creatures that looked like they had been assembled from the thoughts of sleeping gods. They surrounded the transport without aggression, simply observing with attention that felt intensely personal. I transformed their weapons into gardens of living metal, the Empress continued. Their shields became prisons of crystallized thought that still contain their occupants, though they now exist as pure contemplation rather than physical being. Some might consider this fate cruel, but I prefer to think of it as educational. Marcus felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the ship's climate control. The Empire doesn't wish to threaten you. We're hoping to find terms that serve everyone's interests. Everyone's interests, the Empress mused. How fascinating that your empire believes its interests naturally align with those of every other being in the galaxy. Such remarkable confidence in your own righteousness. One of the dream constructs drifted closer to their ship, and Marcus could see that it was formed from what looked like crystallized music, solid notes, and harmonies that had been shaped into a creature that was both beautiful and alien. When it moved, it left trails of song in the vacuum that somehow became visible as ribbons of colored light. Perhaps, the Empress said, it would be more productive to discuss your interests specifically, Marcus Chin of Earth. You are not Valerian, nor are you a willing servant of their empire. What brings a human so far from home in service to conquerors? Marcus realized that the Empress had been listening to their conversations during the approach, or perhaps reading their thoughts directly. In a realm where narrative causality replaced physics, privacy might be just another rule that could be rewritten. My people were captured during Imperial expansion, Marcus admitted. I'm serving the Empire to protect them from worse treatment. Ah, the Empress said, and her voice carried genuine sympathy. The classic hostage scenario. Your compliance purchased with the safety of those you care about. How perfectly imperial in its elegant simplicity. More dream constructs were gathering around the transport, but they showed no signs of hostility. Instead, they seemed curious, as if Marcus and his team were interesting specimens that had wandered into a cosmic menagerie. Would you be willing to consider the Empire's terms? Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect that diplomacy was pointless. I have already considered them, the Empress replied. Surrender of sovereignty in exchange for elevated servitude. Integration of my realm's resources into imperial infrastructure. Transformation of my people from free beings into efficient components of your galactic machine. The terms are quite generous, assuming one values existence over freedom. The Empire offers protection, technological advancement, access to galactic civilization, all at the modest cost of everything that makes existence worthwhile. The Empress interrupted. Marcus, has it occurred to you that your empire's expansion might not be the inevitable triumph of order that they claim it to be? Marcus looked at his team, all of whom were monitoring their instruments and maintaining professional focus. But he could see uncertainty in their postures, as if the Empress's words were raising questions they had been trained not to ask. The Empire maintains peace across hundreds of worlds, Krentak said, speaking up for the first time since they had entered the realm. Imperial authority prevents conflicts that would otherwise devastate entire sectors. Peace, the Empress said, and somehow her voice carried images of the worlds Marcus had seen in the Imperial databases, species reduced to uniform efficiency, their cultures and individuality stripped away in service to galactic order. Yes, the peace of the grave is remarkably stable. Through the viewports, Marcus could see the Eternal Empress's palace growing larger as the dream constructs gently guided their ship toward a landing area that seemed to be made of crystallized intention rather than conventional matter. You will be my guests while we discuss this matter further, the Empress announced. I find that conversation is more productive when conducted face to face, and I am curious about the human who survived contact with Valerian divine energy. Marcus felt a chill. The Empress knew about his encounter with the Supreme God, which meant she had access to information from across the galaxy despite her realm's isolation. Is that an invitation or a command? Marcus asked. In my realm, there is often little difference between the two, the Empress replied. But I assure you that your safety is guaranteed as long as you behave as guests rather than invaders. The ship settled onto the landing area with a sensation like landing on a cloud made of solid music. Through the viewports, Marcus could see gardens of living crystal extending in all directions, tended by beings that looked like they had been sculpted from light and shadow. Environmental readings indicate breathable atmosphere, Kelthane reported, though the composition includes gases that technically don't exist according to standard chemistry. Life support systems are adapting, Mordun added. The ship's reality adjustment protocols are compensating for local physics variations. Marcus stood and checked his equipment, though he wasn't sure how useful conventional tools would prove in a realm where reality followed narrative rules. The others followed his lead, gathering their gear and preparing to disembark. Remember, Vashti said quietly, in narrative space, actions have symbolic significance as well as practical effects. How we behave here may determine not just our survival, but the fundamental nature of our interaction with this realm. They opened the ship's airlock and stepped into the threshold realm. The first thing Marcus noticed was the music. It filled the air like a physical presence, but instead of being heard, it was felt as a vibration that seemed to resonate with his bones and blood. The melody was complex and constantly evolving, as if the entire realm was singing a song that told the story of its existence. The second thing he noticed was the beauty. Every surface, every structure, every living thing in the realm seemed to have been designed by an artist with infinite time and perfect aesthetic sense. The crystalline gardens weren't just functional. They were masterpieces of form and color that made Marcus's eyes water with their perfection. The third thing he noticed was that he was being watched, not by the dream constructs that drifted through the air around them, though they certainly observed the visitors with obvious interest, not by the beings of light and shadow who tended the gardens, though they paused in their work to study the newcomers. Marcus felt the attention of something vast and ancient and impossibly intelligent focused on him with the intensity of a star. "She's beautiful," Vashti whispered, and Marcus looked up to see a figure approaching across the gardens. The Eternal Empress was indeed beautiful, but in a way that made conventional concepts of attractiveness seem inadequate. She appeared human in basic form, but seemed to exist in more dimensions than Marcus's eyes could process, as if he was seeing only a small portion of her true nature. Her hair moved like liquid starlight, and her eyes held depths that suggested she had seen the birth and death of galaxies. But it was her presence that was most overwhelming. She radiated power that made the supreme god's divine energy feel like a candle flame compared to a fusion reactor. When she spoke, reality itself seemed to pause and listen. "Welcome to my realm, travelers," she said, her voice carrying harmonies that made the music in the air sound like a whisper by comparison. "I am pleased to meet beings who have journeyed so far in service to such an interesting cause." She approached Marcus directly, ignoring the others as if they were scenery rather than people. When she stopped in front of him, he realized that she was exactly his height, as if she had adjusted her physical form to match his for the sake of comfortable conversation. "You are the human who absorbed divine energy without harm," she said, studying him with eyes that seemed to see through his skin to examine his soul. "How fascinating. In all my millennia of existence, I have never encountered a being who could process transcendent forces in quite that way." "I don't really understand what happened to me," Marcus admitted. "According to the Empire's scientists, I have cellular modifications that shouldn't exist in natural organisms." The Empress smiled, and her expression held warmth that seemed genuinely caring. "Oh, my dear Marcus, there is nothing natural about your condition. You are the result of an accident that created capabilities your own species doesn't understand." She gestured to the gardens around them, and Marcus saw that the crystalline formations were actually recording devices, preserving moments and memories in solid form. "I have been watching your galaxy for centuries, observing the Empire's expansion and the fate of the worlds they conquer. When you were exposed to exotic matter as a child, it created changes that lay dormant until activated by contact with divine energy." "What kind of changes?" The Empress walked toward her palace, gesturing for Marcus and his team to follow. "You have become something between mortal and transcendent. a being capable of surviving forces that would destroy gods, but still anchored to physical reality in ways that make you interesting. As they walked through the gardens, Marcus noticed that the path they followed seemed to adjust itself to their passage, rearranging the crystal formations to create a route that felt perfectly natural despite being impossible. The Valerian Empire seeks to conquer my realm because it represents power they cannot understand or control, the Empress continued. But they have unknowingly brought me the one being who might be capable of bridging the gap between transcendent and mortal existence. What do you mean? The Empress paused beside a fountain that sprayed liquid light into patterns that told stories of distant worlds. I have a proposition for you, Marcus Chun, one that might serve both your interests and mine, while providing your people with protection that the Empire cannot rescind. Marcus felt his team's attention focus on him with new intensity. Whatever the Empress was about to propose, it was going to change everything about their mission. What kind of proposition? The Eternal Empress smiled, and reality itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of her words. I propose that you become my champion in a contest that will determine the fate of both my realm and your people. Win, and your species will be granted protection under powers far greater than the Valerian Empire. Lose, and both the Threshold Realm and humanity will fall under Imperial control. Marcus stared at the impossibly beautiful being who had just offered to gamble the fate of two civilizations on his performance in some kind of cosmic contest. What kind of contest? A trial by narrative, the Empress replied. The ultimate test of whether order or freedom deserves to inherit the galaxy. The Eternal Empress's palace defied every rule of architecture that Marcus had ever learned. Walls curved in directions that shouldn't have existed, and staircases led to destinations that seemed to shift based on the intention of whoever climbed them. The interior was filled with soft light that had no visible source, but somehow illuminated everything with perfect clarity. Marcus found himself in what the Empress called her contemplation chamber, a circular room where the walls displayed shifting images of distant galaxies, and the floor was made of some kind of crystal that showed reflections of possible futures rather than the present moment. His team had been given quarters elsewhere in the palace, though Marcus suspected that quarters in the Threshold Realm were as flexible a concept as everything else. The Empress had assured them that they would be comfortable and safe, but had requested private conversation with Marcus about her proposed contest. Trial by narrative, Marcus said, settling into a chair that adjusted itself to provide perfect support while feeling like it was made of crystallized comfort. I have to admit, that's not a concept I'm familiar with. The Empress moved through the chamber like a dancer, her presence causing the wall displays to shift and change to complement her motion. When she spoke, her words seemed to create small ripples in reality that made the crystal floor chime softly. In realms where narrative causality replaces physical law, conflicts are resolved through contests that test fundamental principles rather than mere strength or technology, she explained. A trial by narrative pits opposing philosophies against each other in scenarios where the rightness of each approach determines the outcome. Marcus studied the reflections in the crystal floor, watching possible futures flicker past like scenes from unfinished movies. So instead of fighting a war, we would compete in some kind of philosophical test? More than philosophical, the Empress corrected. The contest would manifest real scenarios where your choices and actions demonstrate the validity of the principles you represent. The Empire believes that order, efficiency, and unified control create the greatest good for the greatest number. I believe that freedom, diversity, and individual choice are more valuable than security purchased through subjugation. And I would represent your position in this contest. The Empress paused beside a section of wall that displayed images of Earth, not the planet as it currently existed, but as it might become under different circumstances. Some images showed thriving human colonies expanding across the galaxy in partnership with other species. Others showed efficient imperial worlds where humans had been integrated into the galactic machine as productive but unremarkable components. You would represent humanity's choice, she said. Neither my position nor the Empire's, but the right of your species to determine its own destiny. The contest would test whether imposed order or chosen freedom creates better outcomes for civilizations. Marcus felt the weight of an impossible responsibility settling on his shoulders. What happens if I win? The Valerian Empire would be compelled to grant humanity autonomous status within their sphere of influence. Your people would be protected from conquest, but free to develop according to their own nature. The Threshold Realm would remain independent, serving as a refuge for species that prefer freedom to security. And if I lose? The Empress's expression grew somber. The Threshold Realm would be absorbed into the Empire, its people transformed into efficient servants of imperial order. Humanity would be reclassified as expendable labor, their potential for growth and development sacrificed for immediate utility. Marcus looked around the impossible chamber, trying to process the choice he was being offered. Why me? Surely you could compete in this contest yourself, or choose someone with actual diplomatic or leadership experience. The contest requires a champion who can survive exposure to narrative forces that would destroy most beings, the Empress explained. Your immunity to divine energy suggests that you might also resist reality-warping effects that would overwhelm conventional participants. Moreover, as a human, you have personal investment in the outcome that would make your choices authentic rather than theoretical. She gestured to the wall displays, which now showed images of Marcus's fellow humans being processed on various imperial worlds. Most seemed healthy and reasonably well treated, but their faces held the resigned expression of people who had accepted that their lives belonged to others. The Empire sees your species as useful but unremarkable, the Empress continued. They are not cruel, but they view humans as components to be optimized rather than people with inherent worth. You have the opportunity to change that perception forever. Marcus stood and walked to the wall, studying the images of his people living under imperial rule. They had jobs, housing, medical care, and security. But they also had the hollow look of people who had traded their dreams for safety. What exactly would this contest involve? The Empress joined him at the wall, and the displays shifted to show abstract patterns that somehow conveyed concepts rather than images. The trial would manifest as a series of scenarios drawn from the fundamental tensions between order and freedom. You would be placed in situations where you must choose between security and liberty, efficiency and diversity, control and chaos. Could you give me a specific example? Imagine a colony world facing extinction from environmental collapse, the Empress said, and the wall display immediately showed such a world: dying forests, poisoned oceans, cities struggling against the failure of their life support systems. The imperial solution would be immediate evacuation of useful population to stable worlds, abandonment of the failed ecosystem, and integration of the survivors into existing imperial infrastructure. Quick, efficient, and guaranteed to save lives. The display shifted to show the same world under different circumstances. The freedom-based approach would be to provide the colonists with resources and knowledge to attempt restoration of their world, accepting the risk that they might fail and die in the attempt, but preserving their right to choose their own fate. Marcus studied both scenarios. The imperial approach was clearly more likely to save lives in the short term, but it also meant the destruction of a unique human culture and the loss of whatever potential the colony world might have had for recovery. How would the contest determine which approach was correct? By manifesting the long-term consequences of each choice, the Empress replied. In narrative space, we could observe not just the immediate results, but the ripple effects across decades or centuries. Did imperial efficiency create greater happiness and prosperity, or did it sacrifice irreplaceable values for temporary security? Did freedom's chaos result in disaster and suffering, or in growth and achievement that would have been impossible under control? The concept was staggering. Marcus would be competing in a contest where the stakes were measured not just in lives, but in the fundamental nature of how civilizations developed across the galaxy. How many scenarios would there be? 7, the Empress said.